Ladies and gentlemen, I want to talk to you today about a question that has troubled the hearts of many. Why does God allow suffering? All around us we see pain, heartache, and loss. We see good people facing hardships, families broken by tragedy, and nations torn apart by war. And we ask, where is God? Why doesn't He stop the suffering? But let me tell you something. Suffering is not a sign that God has abandoned us. In fact, it is often in the deepest valleys of pain that we come to know Him most. You see, we live in a world that is broken by sin. When God created man, He gave us free will, the ability to choose between right and wrong. But with that freedom came consequences. Suffering is the result of a fallen world, a world that is turned away from God. But listen to me. God has not turned away from us. When we suffer, God is not distant. He is near. The Bible tells us in Psalm 34:18, "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." Some of you here today may be walking through a storm. You may have lost someone you love. You may be battling sickness, struggling financially, or facing rejection. But I want you to know that God sees you. He knows your pain, and He has a plan. Trials and hardships are an unavoidable part of life. No one escapes suffering, no matter how strong, wealthy, or successful they may be. It comes in different forms: illness, loss, betrayal, financial struggles, or emotional pain. When difficulties arise, the natural response is to question, to resist, and to wonder why such things happen. But there is a truth that many fail to see in the midst of their suffering. Trials are not meant to destroy us. They are meant to strengthen us. They are not a sign of God's absence, but an opportunity to draw closer to Him in ways we never could in times of comfort. Faith is not proven in the absence of trials, but in the endurance of them. It is easy to trust God when life is good, when prayers are answered, and when doors open effortlessly. But real faith is tested in the fire of adversity. It is in those moments of struggle that a person's trust in God is either broken or made stronger. The Bible speaks about this refining process in James 1:2-3, where it says, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance." This does not mean that suffering itself is joyful, but that through it, faith is developed. Gold is purified through intense heat. Without fire, impurities remain, and the gold is not as valuable as it could be. In the same way, suffering is the fire that refines faith, burning away doubt, pride, and reliance on worldly things. It forces a person to recognize their dependence on God alone. When everything else is stripped away, when health, security, or relationships fail, it is then that a person truly realizes that God is their only unshakable foundation. Difficulties also teach humility and trust. When life is comfortable, it is easy to become self-sufficient, to believe that success and stability are the result of personal effort. But trials remind people of their limitations. They bring them to their knees in surrender, acknowledging that only God can provide true strength and direction. This is not a sign of weakness, but of spiritual growth. The Apostle Paul understood this well when he wrote in Corinthians 12:9, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." It is in moments of weakness that God's power is most clearly revealed. Suffering also deepens a person's relationship with God. When hardships come, people either turn away from Him in anger or run to Him for comfort. Those who seek Him in their struggles often find a depth of faith they never knew before. They learn to pray not just out of routine, but out of desperation. They open their hearts to Him fully, realizing that He is the only source of peace in the storm. They come to understand that true faith is not about avoiding trials, but about trusting God through them. Trials teach patience and endurance. In an age where instant gratification is expected, suffering forces people to wait, to trust, and to rely on God's timing rather than their own. It builds character and shapes a person into someone who is not easily shaken by life's difficulties. The greatest testimonies of faith often come from those who have endured great suffering and emerged stronger, not because they avoided pain, but because they found strength in God through it. There are countless stories of individuals who have faced immense trials and come out with a stronger faith. Those who have suffered great loss often become the most compassionate. Those who have endured deep pain often develop the greatest understanding of God's love. Those who have struggled the most often become the ones who encourage others. Suffering, when faced with faith, does not leave a person weaker. It makes them into someone who stands firm, someone whose trust in God is unshakable, and someone whose life reflects his strength and grace. Jesus Christ, the Son of God, suffered more than any person who has ever walked this earth. He experienced physical pain, emotional anguish, and spiritual separation. He was betrayed by one of his closest followers, abandoned by his friends, falsely accused, mocked, beaten, and nailed to a cross. The suffering he endured was not just a moment of pain, it was an intentional sacrifice. He could have stopped it at any time. He had the power to call down angels to rescue him, to silence his accusers, to step down from the cross, but he chose to suffer. He willingly bore the weight of sin, not because he deserved it, but because he loved the world so much that he was willing to endure the ultimate pain so that salvation could be made available to all. His suffering was not meaningless. It was part of God's perfect plan. It was the fulfillment of prophecy, the greatest act of love ever shown. Isaiah 53:5 says, "But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed." Every lash he took, every insult he bore, every drop of blood he shed had a purpose. It was through his suffering that the door to eternal life was opened. Jesus understands suffering in a way that no one else can. When people go through pain, they sometimes feel as if no one truly understands what they are facing. But Jesus does. He knows what it means to feel abandoned, to cry out in agony, to face rejection, to endure physical torment. He experienced the full weight of human suffering, so that when his followers face trials, they can be assured that he not only sees their pain, but has walked through it. This is why he is called the great high priest who sympathizes with human weakness. He does not observe suffering from a distance, he enters into it and offers comfort from a place of understanding. The suffering of Jesus also shows that pain can have a purpose. When people suffer, they often ask why. They wonder if there is any meaning in their hardship, any reason for their pain. The cross is the answer. If the worst suffering in history, the crucifixion of the innocent Son of God, could bring about the greatest good, then no suffering is without meaning. God can take what seems like a tragedy and turn it into something beautiful. The pain that feels unbearable today may be the very thing God uses to bring about redemption, transformation, and a deeper understanding of his love. Through his suffering, Jesus also gave an example of how to endure trials. He did not complain or retaliate. He did not curse those who hurt him. Instead, he prayed for them. In Luke 23:34, he said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." Even in his pain, he showed love. This is a powerful lesson for those who face suffering today. Hardship often brings out bitterness, anger, or a desire for revenge, but Jesus demonstrated a different way, the way of love, patience, and trust in God's plan. His suffering was not the end of the story. After the cross came the resurrection. What seemed like the darkest moment in history became the greatest victory. This is the hope for all who suffer. Pain is not the final word. God's plan is greater than the suffering of the moment. Just as Jesus' suffering led to redemption, the trials of life can lead to a deeper relationship with God, a greater faith, and a future filled with hope. Suffering is one of the hardest realities of life. It is painful, it is exhausting, and at times it can feel never-ending. Many people struggle to understand why hardships exist and wonder if there will ever be relief from the burdens they carry. But the promise of God is clear. Suffering is temporary. There will come a day when pain, sorrow, and loss will be no more. This is the great hope that sustains those who trust in him. The trials of this life are not the final chapter. There is an eternal future where suffering will cease and joy will be made complete. From the beginning of time, God has had a plan for his people. He never intended for them to live in a world filled with sickness, death, and despair. When sin entered the world, it brought suffering with it, but God was not caught off guard. He had already prepared a way for redemption, a way to restore what had been broken. His plan was not just to provide comfort in suffering, but to one day remove it completely. The Bible describes this in Revelation 21:04, saying, "He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away." This is the future that awaits those who put their trust in him. Right now, pain and loss may seem overwhelming, but they are not eternal. Every hardship has an expiration date. The sickness that weakens the body, the grief that weighs down the soul, the struggles that seem impossible to overcome, all of these things will one day be gone. No more funerals, no more hospital rooms, no more broken hearts. This is the promise that believers hold on to, the assurance that this world is not their final home. There is a greater reality beyond what can be seen, a place where suffering does not exist. God's plan is not just about removing suffering, but also about restoring what has been lost. In his perfect timing, he will make all things new. The pain that was endured will be replaced with eternal joy. The tears that were shed will be turned into laughter. The sorrow that felt unbearable will be nothing compared to the glory that is to come. This is not just a hopeful thought. It is a certainty. The Apostle Paul understood this when he wrote in Romans 8:18, "I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us." Whatever pain is experienced in this life is small in comparison to the eternal joy that awaits. For those who are walking through suffering, it is important to remember that God is preparing something greater. The trials of today are not without purpose, and they are not without an end. Even when the road seems long and the burden feels too heavy, the promise remains the same. One day, suffering will be no more. The hope of eternity is what gives strength to endure, the assurance that the pain of this world is only temporary. Until that day comes, God provides comfort in the midst of suffering. He does not leave his people to struggle alone. He walks with them, strengthens them, and reminds them that their pain is not the end of the story. Every hardship faced today is leading toward a future where suffering will be completely erased. God's plan is not just to help his people survive their trials, but to bring them into a place where pain will never touch them again.